Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast, where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about a movie I just saw and have been waiting to watch for a while, called Climax. So, this movie came out in 2018. It's by director Gaspar Noir, I think is how you pronounce his name, something like that. He's a French director. And essentially what this film is a really unique, like an incredibly unique art house film. And I guess you could say it's like partially a dance film with a touch of maybe drama, but primarily a psychological horror film. And just before I get into describing exactly like what the film is, I will say this is one of those films, one of those rare occasions where I can say for certain this really, if I just by describing the plot, you can't really spoil this film. I think so much of it is in the experience, in the emotions it provokes from the audience, that it's kind of difficult to really ruin this film. And I only bring this up because I avoided watching any information about it or listening to any information about it because it was recommended to me as a psychological horror that was pretty unique, so I wanted to go in as blind as possible. But honestly, I think my experience would have been that hampered by knowing a little bit about the plot. But essentially what this film is a group of dancers all agree to being in a dance troupe, and they go to a place for rehearsal. But what ends up happening is after the rehearsal, they're kind of hanging around, getting to know each other, party, and that kind of thing. And the drink they have, the sangria, is spiked with LSD. And from that point on, it kind of is this escalation in anxiety and tension that kind of culminates in a pretty hellish final act. And I say this film is incredibly unique and interesting because so many conventions are just utterly destroyed in this film. It comprises of primarily like there's a lot of scenes of characters talking. There's two incredibly long dance sequences, but a lot of the film is taken up by like one take, really long shots with tons of coordination between multiple actors, and the way that kind of sound is used is pretty brilliant because, like I said at the start, the whole film is incredibly anxiety inducing, and it builds a lot of tension, but it doesn't really do this through showing a whole heck of a lot. It's mostly just it's mostly just what you're seeing and understanding, but not necessarily fully seeing what the characters are experiencing. Because every character in this film is obviously under the effect, almost every character is under the effect of an incredibly high dose of hallucinogen or high dose of psychedelics. And what ends up happening is essentially just a bunch of actions that can only, some of which can only be explained by someone in a kind of fucked head state. And others that are just almost like accidents, but just trying to empathize and imagine what a character is seeing through their eyes and through their performance is kind of where all the horror's at in this film. And it's delivered pretty masterfully, in my opinion. All the actors do a stellar job. Like there's a ton of like body and physical performance in this, as opposed to just strict, strict dialogue or something like that. And the amount of ideas that each actor can actually communicate just via their body is incredibly impressive. I remember one sequence in particular where the lead actress kind of walks into a room on her own near the peak of the film, and she just experiences a ton of different emotions, throws her body in multiple different ways, has moments of calm, moments of extreme panic and screaming and that kind of thing. And all of this is just incredibly believable under the influence of that type of drug. But the moment that really stood out to me is there was a moment where she puts her hands under her tights. She's kind of like, just experiencing the heightened sensations of touch, right? But what she realizes is, like, after she opens her eyes, her hands are under just her tights, but she starts completely freaking out. And it doesn't take too much imagination to understand roughly why the character's freaking out, or why not being able to get her arms away from her legs and seeing this stuff over her legs almost stretch out with it. You can understand like why that would freak someone out under those kinds of like hallucinogens. So all of that part of the film is incredibly well done. It's pretty terrifying in a lot of ways. It wasn't quite as emotionally impactful on me as I thought it was gonna be, because I think it's just because I don't, I'm not a particularly anxious person at all, so those kind of emotions never hit quite as hard as me. The more psychological and empathetic side was a very scary thought. Like, seeing what these characters see under those drugs would be, I mean, it would be like absolutely traumatic. So that element of it was pretty terrifying, kind of being trapped in this location. In this scenario, it would be wild. But that's kind of like why the film is so effective. But I guess like I should probably speak about the other elements that you wouldn't necessarily expect if you're aware of the director, aware of the kind of film scene it's a part of, and maybe his previous films as well. So this film is part of the French extremism movement, as far as I'm aware, which is mostly films that are like just incredibly extreme in lots of different ways, and this film definitely does deliver in that aspect towards the back half. But for the most part, this film is actually just like an incredibly mesmerizing and hypnotizing dance film. The two dance sequences in this film are shot incredibly creatively, and one thing that I don't think I've really seen before is it honestly, even in the moments where it gets more horrific, the camera almost feels like it's performing a dance of its own. It complements so much of what's happening in the room, not only to show you interesting shots and angles, but with characters looking towards the camera when realistically they wouldn't be looking at an audience member in that place. It's like it doesn't make sense as part of the dance, but it helps draw the audience member into the film a ton. Like I remember there's a moment in the first sequence where the camera kind of like goes towards the dance troupe as they're dancing and goes above them and looks down, and all of the actors are looking up towards the camera, and kind of you have these like really kind of like visceral body movements and dances while the head stays perfectly still, and it just creates this really like hypnotic and mesmerizing it just creates that kind of like emotion, I guess. I was absolutely glued to the screen from front to back. There's very little in this film that feels like it's just there to pad out anything or anything like that. But everything in this film feels very necessary. There's conversations between characters that are incredibly naturalistic, and after watching the film I actually found out that a lot of it was improvised, and a lot of it was kind of like they had like maybe 5 hours of footage for the conversations and cut it all down to a 15-minute section or something like that, only taking the most interesting relevant parts for each character. And it works really well to create a just very organic feeling sense of conversation between characters. So yeah, I mean, I was just super impressed with this film. I thought the lighting was absolutely excellent. The camera work was some of the best I've seen. Conceptually, I thought it was incredibly impactful. Yeah, there was just a ton of love on. A ton of stuff to enjoy. I thought it was a pretty excellent film. I had a surprisingly great time. It's definitely not for everyone. I'll say that much. It is still part of the French extremism movement, and this film is very extreme in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people will find it much more stressful than I did, especially in the back half. And I mean, like I said, not to say that I didn't feel stressed while watching. It was still a very uncomfortable watch at moments, and very, very stressful. But never to a point where it was unenjoyable for me, I guess is what I should say. But I could imagine that being the case for some people. In fact, I know some people that wouldn't enjoy this film because they would just be too stressed out the entire time. But yeah, I'm just trying to think of other things I could praise about it, or interesting things to note. One thing I will say is a lot of the horror comes from a very interesting place, in my opinion. Actually, this kind of goes back into the organic sounding conversations. While this is described as a horror film, it really doesn't have that many horror cliches or anything you would consider like that. It's almost like an extreme drama film, I guess you could say, because the whole scenario is completely grounded. There's nothing in it that's supernatural or anything even close to that, really. You could maybe say that some of the characters maybe act a little bit unreasonable at parts, but that's about as far as it goes in terms of bizarre suspension of belief stuff, I guess. But yeah, the whole film just feels incredibly grounded, and that's where the majority of the horror comes from. But at the same time, calling it a horror almost feels a little bit weird, although it probably is. But I think the best description of this film I've seen is I saw someone describe it as mentally upsetting, and I think that's a really good way to put it, because the more you kind of like think about the headspace of the characters and the emotions they were going through, it's like, yeah, the whole thing would be incredibly traumatic. The whole thing feels very real because of how organic the conversations are, and because of how grounded the situation is very believable. So I think mentally upsetting is a very, very good way to describe it. But yeah, I fucking loved this film. I thought the performances were incredible. I thought the camera work was particularly standout. I'm very eager to watch Gaspar Noir's other films, especially because, again, this one just breaks so many conventions in terms of basically every way you could think of filmmaking. Like, the film opens with the end credits. Like, you literally have a shot of Snow and a woman walking out, and then, like, the end credits roll. The opening credits are in the middle of the film. The back half of the film is more or less one, like, the last, like, what feels like, I don't know, must be like 30 minutes. It's just one long shot, essentially. The opening comprises of two dance sequences and, like, two montages, I guess. One of interviews of characters and another of characters speaking to each other. So it's a very unconventional film in a lot of regards. So again, it's definitely not for everyone. But if you're into unconventional filmmaking, and just very mesmerizing atmospheric films, definitely give this one a shot. 100%. I don't think you'll be disappointed. There's a chance you'll hate it, but I don't think it will still provoke some kind of pretty dramatic response out of you, no matter whether you love it or hate it. So I don't think it'll be disappointing. That'd probably be a weird. I think that'd be a weird. It'd be hard to imagine someone that would be disappointed by this film, I guess. But yeah, go check it out if you're interested. It's a bit of a nightmare to find a good copy of, but you could probably order a Blu-ray if I had a look around. I managed to find so it's on Amazon Prime, but you have to rent it, so that's how I watched it. But yeah, go check it out if you're interested. Cheers for listening, and peace out.